Hey there, it's Ben from patternprofits.net bringing you the weekend update and weekly watch list. Zooming out this week, still starting with IWO, but we're on a weekly chart here. Looking at that big red candle from last week, closed below the volume shelf point of control. And I threw some fibs on there just to show we kind of don't want to get too overly bearish here, as we are holding the fib level plus anchored VWAP from off of the low of the prior base. So when we look at IWO and small cap growth, there's, it's an area that could potentially see some support. The problem is if we go over to FFTY, which is the other proxy I like to use, this one looks much worse. We did have an inside week here last week, but just breaking all the levels, whether they were fib levels. Cloud, that's 1013 that I use here, that acted as resistance last week, closed below the low from the previous base, that anchored VWAP there. You're below that. Does look like easily make a visit to that 38.2 retracement around the 40 mark. You do have this big empty area here of volume 2 that could easily fill in. So, but this also can happen very quickly. So don't want to get too overly bearish here. I think another thing that's important to keep an eye on this coming week is TLT. Thinking in terms of symmetry here, as well as, we kind of saw tech rally along with this climb in bonds. That's when yields really came off and tech was able to rally. Now looking at the symmetry of this kind of head and shoulders pattern, left shoulder here, head here, potential to put in a right shoulder on this side and have that rolled over. If that should happen to be the case, we'll have to watch correlations closely and see what happens as far as, does everything roll over, participate to the downside, or do maybe we see a lift in the value side of the equation and potentially, and I mentioned this last week, potentially financials, if rates should start to work their way back up and we do get a right shoulder here as bonds roll over. Let's get into a few that I think are holding up well and may be worth keeping an eye on early next week, just in case we do see some strength. Let me switch over here, though, to the daily chart, get away from the weekly view. So this is DocuSign, which held up quite well last week. It helped that Motley Fool gave it a recommendation, but you were kind of putting in this handle, which we had talked about prior to. We had a nice run off the bottom in this double bottom pattern. Once we cleared that pivot, a nice run towards those prior highs. Now putting in a handle. You have quite a few that look just like this. Datadog is another one. Had a nice run off the bottom, double bottom pattern. Once cleared that pivot, didn't quite make it up to the prior highs, but also putting in a handle here. Crowd, and I don't think these are necessarily ones that we're ready to actively participate in, just worth keeping an eye on to see how they act. Some of them are retesting these prior pivots, but again, they had nice runs pulling back. Most of them are coming on declining volume, so certainly worth keeping an eye on. Inside day there as well. I also have a couple more now. We talked about this one last week. This one tried to go, cleared that 560, 529 pivot, but reversed, and then now putting in a handle there. Not the worst thing that could happen here, but we'll just have to see how these act. Roku is another one. A good week to just kind of go slow, kind of see how things act, and just pay attention, not necessarily actively participate in all of this. 462.99 pivot here as this came in, and now retesting that 397.69 pivot, which was the double bottom pattern. So we're right back to that level there. So there, like I said, there's quite a few of these patterns that may be worth keeping an eye on. Do have a couple to watch for potential breakouts. I think TMO, yep, TMO is one. And again, this looks very similar to some of the others that I've showed you, but 526.59. Nice run off the bottom, double bottom. Now put in the handle and actually starting to make the turn. 1020 cloud acting as support. So we'll see if it can push through that prior pivot. That's one. I'm also watching from the peg list. INMD, Inmode had a great power earnings gap as they reported early, and nice volume, big push, took out the high. I ended up getting stopped out when the overall market rolls over. It was hard to, like a salmon swimming upstream, hard to make progress when the overall market was bright red. So it did get back here below anchored VWAP off the power earnings gap, but then had a decent day on Friday, closed right at that level. So another one just kind of keeping on the radar to see how it acts and maybe give a guide, going forward. As you can see, late last week did get that. It looked like it was ready to roll over and come down. The expectation, remember, usually when the anchored VWAP fails is to fill the gap here. But point of control and the volume shelf did hold up and actually closed very, very tight with that anchored VWAP from off of the power earnings gap. So just another one worth watching just to see how it acts. We've got quite a few earnings reports coming up next week, so we'll have more feedback as far as that goes. I do have one other one, KMX. CarMax, another one that I think is worth keeping an eye on, just again to see how it acts. Cup with handle pattern. Here you have 137.53 pivot. Nice little handle, volume has come back. You did have a power earnings gap here, and you've got an inside day there to work with. Volume shelf, point of control just below. Again, I would tread very lightly, if at all, but a few patterns to keep an eye on just to kind of gauge how things are working. You do have the prior high 138.77 here. That's really all I have on watch for early in the week. See how things act during the week, see what sets up as the week goes on. I did a video on the put call ratio. Hopefully you guys watch that, because that may give you some clues early in the week. If we do see those numbers I talked about there, those high put call ratios often help to confirm a bottom. So that will be something we'll be keeping a close eye on early next week too. If you haven't already, check out that video and we'll see how the market acts during the start of the week. That's all I've got. I will see you guys over on FinTwit. Have a great trading week.